Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Julie Park, and I'm the current director of the Asian American Studies program at the University of Maryland. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the Asian American and Election 2020 webinar. Before saying anything else, we'd like to first thank Juanita Tamayo-Lott and her endowment for sponsoring this event. The purpose of this funding is to bring UMD and Asian American Studies and the broader community together to better understand and appreciate the distinctive role of public policy across the federal executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The goal is to stimulate civic engagement and encourage careers in federal service. So thank you, Juanita, for just all that you've been doing. So today we have two amazing speakers lined up for this webinar. First, we have Christine Chen, and she's the founding and current executive director of APIAVote. She has strengthened and expanded APIAVote's partnerships into 28 states. Christine is well known by activists across the country. Her track record in building coalitions and working at the grassroots and national levels established her as one of the strongest voices in the APIA community. She has more than 2 decades of experience in organizing and advocating on issues such as immigration, hate crimes, affirmative action, the census, racial profiling, voting rights, election reform, and various derogatory and racist media incidents. She has also served as president of Strategic Alliances USA, which is a consulting firm specializing in coalition building, institutional development, and partnerships among the corporate sector, government agencies, and the nonprofit and public sector. Welcome, Christine. So great to have you. And second, we have our very own Professor Janelle Wong. She is a joint appointment in Asian American Studies, as well as in American Studies and Government and Politics. Professor Wong is the author of several books, including most recently, Immigrants, Evangelicals, and Politics in an Era of Demographic Change. She is also a co-principal investigator on the National Asian American Survey, a nationwide survey on Asian American political and social attitudes. She has served on the national board of the Association for Asian American Studies, and her advocacy work has focused on support for affirmative action and other Asian American issues. Welcome, Janelle, as well. So before we begin, we would like this to be interactive. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function below. It's at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of Christine and Janelle's presentations, I will ask the questions to our panelists. Also, just as a reminder, that the session will be recorded. So just wanted to put that out there. So now I think I will hand it over. I think Janelle is going first, correct?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. We are very excited to share some new data with you and to talk about what it means, what the Asian American electorate, the trends that we are experiencing as we head into election 2020. Let me just go ahead and start this. So I wanted to also thank Director Julie Park and Jessica Lee at the Asian American Studies program and Juanita Tamayo-Lott, of course, for sponsoring this program. Let me give you some background because Asian Americans are often, there hasn't been very much information on Asian Americans as we head into election 2020, but we are very close to being at the day of the election. And so I wanted to just share some background. We are the fastest growing racial group in the country, and we are also the fastest growing segment of the US electorate. And with record high turnout in 2018, people are expecting also record high turnout in 2020 for Asian Americans. Asian Americans are concentrated in a lot of safe states like California, New York, Hawaii. And so we don't get a ton of attention, but I think it's really critical to understand that we are actually becoming a more critical mass in some competitive swing states and in congressional districts that are going to be hard fought over this election. So you can see here that Nevada, North Carolina, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, these are all places where Asian Americans comprise a critical mass of voters. It's also critical to understand that people are interested in immigrant voters with changing demographics in the US, and now the immigrant vote is made up of about as many Asian Americans as Latinx people. So Asian Americans are the group that is the only group in the US that is majority immigrant. And what that means for our community is that language translation tends to be actually a greater need among Asian Americans than Latinos in the US. So I'm going to talk about some of the trends in which that we're converging around, but it's really been fascinating to watch our political evolution as we see that, you know, we talk about in Asian American studies how much diversity there is in the Asian American community, but it's also been really noteworthy how much this community has converged around key issues, and I'll talk about that soon. So I'm going to present some new data from a survey that was just released this week of a little over 1,500 registered Asian American voters. This sample includes Chinese, Filipino, Asian Indian, Korean, Japanese, and Vietnamese registered voters, and that covers about 75% of all Asian Americans. We didn't have the capacity to include other groups, but of course we would love to do that in the future. These interviews were conducted in various Asian languages, and they were conducted on the telephone and online. And you can see the different sample sizes here, and all of these data are also available via the API data and API data website, and also on the APIAVote website, which I dropped into the chat. So let me just get to it. In terms of the findings from this brand new survey, what we see are that Asian Americans are, as a whole, really highly motivated to vote. So they're really enthusiastic. And the issues that they care most about are the economy, healthcare, and education. That tends to be high for all groups, but also racial discrimination. We see a kind of progressive leaning on issues like immigration, racial justice, gun control, and environmental protection. And we also asked about COVID. And so we can see that COVID is definitely affecting the community in very unique ways. So let me just show you, I'm going to show a lot of data. And again, you can see these and just focus on them a little bit more closely if you go to the link in the chat. But for now, I'll just do an overview. So for all of these slides, we break down the different national origin groups, but you can also see that in capital letters, there will be a bar that says Asian American, and I'll focus on that for the purposes of this presentation. So Asian American, that's all the groups together. We can see that they are more enthusiastic overall compared to past elections about the upcoming presidential race. In terms of party identification, the community is leaning Democrat, so they're almost twice as likely to be Democrats than Republicans, but still a big chunk of independents within our community. It's notable, though, that there are more Democrats than independents in the community now. This has been a change. There used to be more independents than any other group. In terms of contact, we're seeing that even though this group is so fast growing, there are many Asian Americans that have not been contacted at all, 50% by either of the two major parties. So you can see also that Republican outreach tends to be lower towards Asian Americans. Really, no party has put a lot of resources into mobilization. So I think this is still a community that's really up for grabs. In terms of vote choice, we see that Asian Americans are leaning towards Joe Biden. So we see that 54% say that they'll support Biden. 30% are saying they'll vote for Trump. And there's still, again, about 15% of people who say they don't know. You can see there's a lot of variation, but for all groups except Vietnamese Americans, Biden is performing better than Trump. And that's partly, you can see these favorability ratings. So Asian Americans feel, 1 out of 5 feels very favorable towards Biden. And then there's another big group of people, 34%, who feel favorable, but not very favorable. If we look at Trump, we can see that there's a lot of red. So there's a lot of people who feel very unfavorable towards Trump, almost half of the sample. In terms of policy priorities, and I should just note, this is all registered voters only, and these data are weighted to reflect the population too. So here you see that jobs in the economy, it's almost all blue, it's still a very important issue, especially over the last few months for all Asian Americans. Healthcare, Asian Americans are healthcare voters. So again, looking at the capitalized Asian American bar, you can see that almost 90% of Asian Americans, actually 90% of Asian Americans say that this issue is going to be important for them going into the election. And if we go to education, that is also high. It tends to be high for all racial groups. If we go to actual policy preferences, so not just the areas in which they're interested, there's some really interesting data here. We can see that Asian Americans are actually big government supporters. So we asked them, do you prefer a bigger government with more services versus a smaller government with fewer services? We can see that Asian Americans are more likely to say a bigger government with more services. Only 19% say a smaller government with fewer services. And this is true of almost all the groups. There's some variation, but all of the groups are much more likely to say a bigger government and more services. Healthcare, this is a healthcare question that focuses on undocumented immigrants. Would Asian Americans agree that health insurance should be extended to all immigrants regardless of legal status? And we see here that Asian Americans lean more progressive on this issue. And that's the same for a pathway to citizenship, whether or not undocumented immigrants should have a pathway to citizenship. We can see that that tends to be quite a few Asian Americans that support that kind of change in policy. Climate change, not very many people think about Asian Americans as environmental voters, but they certainly are. You can see here that the vast majority of Asian Americans really want the federal government to step in to reduce the effects of climate change. So this, I think, points to something that's really interesting in our community. Outreach tends to be, the parties do outreach around education and around immigration because those are the first things they think about when it comes to our community, but they're not thinking about these other really pressing issues that Asian Americans, in fact, do show significant distinctions from the general population on. They are more likely to call themselves environmentalists. Gun control is another issue in which Asian Americans are way more progressive than other people in the US. So you can see here that 80% of Asian Americans support stricter gun control laws. Finally, we'll go to race discrimination and policies related to those topics. So Asian Americans are reporting that they believe Asian Americans face a lot of discrimination. So you can see in the blue that Asian Americans, almost 1 out of 4 think Asian Americans face a lot of discrimination. There's some variation by group. They also believe that Black people face a lot of discrimination. They're more likely to say a lot here. Muslims are also a group that Asian Americans believe face a lot or at least some discrimination. And so that colors, I think, their views about civil rights. So should the government do more to give Blacks equal rights with whites? And you can see that Asian Americans on the whole do support, and this question is interesting, do support federal policy interventions to give Blacks more equal rights with whites. This is a really pressing issue today, which is support for police reforms. This is a question that tries to get at the the policies behind the idea of defunding the police. So should local governments shift their spending from law enforcement to other kinds of programs, you can see here that over half of Asian Americans agree that those shifts should take place. In terms of affirmative action, this is also really interesting. We've actually seen affirmative action become more of a consensus issue for Asian Americans, but maybe not in the way that you would suspect. Asian Americans actually strongly favor affirmative action, and this question was asked about access to higher education in particular. You can see that Chinese Americans are the least likely to support, and Indians are the most likely. And that's a pattern we've seen over and over. We've also seen that about 70% of Asian Americans have supported affirmative action over the last decade. Finally, I'll turn to COVID-related issues. So there's a lot of worry in the Asian American community. Over half of Asian Americans worry about hate crimes, harassment, and discrimination because of COVID. And I will actually stop there. I have some other data to show, but I would like to turn it over to Christine, who's been on the ground mobilizing Asian Americans.
Great, thanks, Janelle. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I just wanted to go ahead and go through a little bit more about what has been done in terms of trying to mobilize during this pandemic. But I did go ahead and wanted to ask everyone this question, like whether or not you have spoken to family and friends about voting or elections. So it's really great to see that this crowd, a large majority of you have. The reason I always ask that question and start out with that is because we don't realize that based on the data that's shown, that half of our family or friends are typically not engaged and not ready to be registered and to go vote for election day. I think many times because we are these days in our different silos, that we are focusing on communities or individuals that are already engaged sometimes and don't realize that there's really half of our community is not ready for that. So with that, I want to go ahead and start out from the beginning of an overview of what we are doing. So APIAVote, we are a national organization, and our model is to work with different nonprofits as well as student organizations across the country to build their capacity to increase voter registration and civic participation. So heading into 2020, we realized that it was going to be a really busy year. This is all before the pandemic. And we knew that we were going to have the census to make sure that our community was going to be counted. We had the primary elections as well as the general elections in November. So we went ahead and conducted over 50 regional trainings to really get the community and student organizations ready and prepared and have their plans ready for implementation for 2020. So we really started out the year focusing on census, whether it was student organizations, our ambassador programs, as well as our as well as our community-based organizations. We had these 2-minute census videos in 28 API languages. We relied on the younger generation to share those videos to start conversations with their families. We also created specific language pages. The reason I point this out to you is because we are in the process of creating something similar, but with voting information. In addition, we were able to also supplement our census outreach with about 320,000 worth of ad buys in ethnic community press that was not being covered by the US Census. Obviously, then we were faced with the pandemic, and so a lot of our groups and volunteers then pivoted where they went and utilized our voter files to phone bank for the census. And then we also had a census hotline, so that way if individuals had questions, we were there to answer any questions. Because of all that phone banking, a lot of our organizations are in a very good situation where they've cleaned up the lists, and so heading into the election cycle, we have stronger lists, and we've already been engaging with these individuals on the census side. And so these organizations are continuing their relationship with them as they head into the November elections. Also earlier in the year, hopefully many of you were able to join us. If not, it is also available online. We hosted our 2020 presidential town hall. We had over 1.1 million views of this town hall, and it was really exciting because we've been doing this since 2008. But this was the first time that we had a presumptive presidential nominee come and participate, engage in conversation, and to answer questions directly from the community leaders. And so we're hoping to continue to build upon that success and really showing that candidates really need to continue to engage and talk and with our community directly. In addition, we also hosted 40 workshops and 20 regional convenings within a 10-day period through our National API Leadership Summit to build upon the interest from the town hall in itself. So for APIAVote, it's been really a crucial part to build out a voter engagement program for younger voters. Traditionally, API voters have the lowest voter registration and participation rate in comparison to other communities of color, as well as within our own demographics within the API umbrella. Which is always interesting because many times we hear from younger organizers saying, hey, how can I start conversations with my parents to go ahead and get them to vote? But in reality, the data is also showing that they actually need to first focus on their own peer group and friends. So our cohort, this is actually is actually a 16th month program where student organizations are brought on. They come together. Well, luckily we were able to get everyone together back in 2019, where we went ahead and went through a whole weekend of trainings, also brainstorming in terms of what they can be doing. They actually meet on a regular basis as a cohort, as well as setting up individual one-on-ones with our staff member, Julie Wu, who does one-on-one coaching with them. So each of them has a goals and field plans where they first had to start out with focusing on what they could do to educate their own peers about census. And then now everyone is focusing on voter registration, especially since next week is National Voter Registration Day. And then in October, they will be focusing on helping us phone bank to their peers, as well as a larger group of API young voters to go ahead and talk to them and making sure that they create their own plans to actually go vote. Along the way, there will be different events that they would host just to continue to educate and really drive energy in terms of getting the word out. This is also done, but in a different way, with our community-based partners in 28 states. They also have their own goals for census, as well as voter registration, education, and GOTV work as well. And then whenever possible, if there are organizations in the same city as our ambassadors, we try to go ahead and connect them up so that way they could work with one another. One of the things that we are doing is that we've identified enough resources to mail to 700,000 API households and voters. This is a sample of one of the mailers that we are sending out. Each mailer is specific to that state. And in addition, through our partners, we've identified which communities will need the language assistance. And that's how we determine what languages are actually provided to them. So what will happen is that after we get this to the printers, we will be converting them into social media graphics in hopes that all of you can be able to use this, especially if you're coming from a particular state, and to be able to engage voters and making sure that they understand what are their options in terms of early voting and helping them make a plan to vote. And this is always coupled with phone banking and texting. So once again, we'll carve out the universe where those that have cell phones and where we have a younger demographic will be handled by our ambassadors, and then the older generation will be focusing will be touched through our nonprofit partners. In addition, we are looking at engaging with a number of influencers and really utilizing their reach, and also the use of social media to really focus on as I said, in September, all about voter registration, then early vote, and then election day and election and knowing your rights. So with that, we just launched a partnership with Sony Music, and we are in discussions with her as well as, oh my gosh, I just blanked out on her name. I will come to that unless, and then also with Apple from Black Eyed Peas, and they are looking to do some type of engagement with us. We're looking at some type of live event. So please stay tuned and hopes that you'll also be able to join in the celebration as we highlight really Sony's theme of your voice, your power, your vote. In addition, Apple's foundation with Black Eyed Peas, they have also started to videotape and create a campaign called Your Vote Matters to Me Too. And so we will be working with them in helping them figure out what kind of messaging they need to be launching, what resources they should be directing this to, but all this content will be sprinkled out throughout starting next week and then throughout October for all of us to use and to start conversations with everyone in hopes that we could go ahead and get them registered and to vote in itself. Once again, I want to just point out that our research page does provide all this information about the survey as well as other fact sheets and information about each particular state. Another resource I want to note is that it really is also important to know what your voting rights are and to educate our own community about, you know, what are the potential scenarios that they may face. And so that way they know how to, especially if they're not registered or they're actually not listed in the voter rolls, although they registered, and what are the things that they could do. So we have these voting rights videos that are also translated, as well as these voting rights in language pages. So once again, I am lifting these up, even though I know many of you do not need these in language materials, but especially during a pandemic, we are in a situation where many of you are in a household where we're going to be leaning on you to be having conversations and providing resources as you have these interactions and intergenerational opportunity. And then the last part I want to focus on is really noting how we need to eliminate barriers to voting. So we continue to host our 888 APIAVote hotline in multiple languages with Asian American Advancing Justice. Also with Lyft, we just created a partnership with them where they're providing us $15,000 worth of ride credits that we will be working with different partners to really provide these credits to low-income communities. So that way we can eliminate transportation to the polls by providing these resources. The other thing is where I really need all of your help is we need an army to be built to really push back on disinformation. We know heading into October, there is going to be a lot of fake news, and people are going to have to learn what is fake versus what is fact. We're trying to really develop a network of volunteers that have different access to different social media platforms, different spaces where the API community of different ages and different demographics may reside in. So that way we have different eyes looking out and trying to figure out what type of disinformation may be out there, letting us know so that way we could create content, so that way you could use that to push back, as well as we're part of a larger network of progressive organizations that will be keeping an eye on this with legal, also with a legal team. And so we'll be receiving information from them in terms of seeing what are some of the trends that we need to push out to all of you as well. So with that, I think those are just a really quick glimpse in terms of what everyone is doing, as well as our ambassadors and what you can do. I'm going to turn it back over to Janelle right now. And then after that, I will come back to talk about specifically some other action items that you could take.
All right, give me a minute. I just need to pull up our video again. All right, so I wanted to just take a little bit of time to talk about what young Asian Americans care about, especially as we head into the election. And so part of our data broke out people who were 18 to 34 years old. And we can see from these data what young Asian American registered voters say that they think are the most important issues heading into November. So the issues on which younger Asian American voters seem to be distinct from the Asian American population, registered voter population as a whole, were on these issues, that they look like they cared a little bit more about the issue of immigration, the environment, which, as you know, many Asian Americans say that they care about, but younger Asian American voters were even more likely to say this was important to them: racism, police reforms, and income inequality. On the other hand, they were less likely than the Asian American population as a whole in this sample to say that national security will be important as we go into November 2020. In terms of political participation, we did get some variation from the general population here. So we can see from our data that younger Asian American voters, and again, this is a group that's 18 to 34 years old, were less likely to have donated to a campaign. And that makes sense because many are more in a more economically precarious position because they're younger, but they were more likely to have discussed politics with family and friends, similar to the numbers that you all reported. They were more likely than other Asian Americans to have posted about politics on social media, and they were more likely to say that they had attended a rally, a march, or demonstration. And so we do see, because all of the participants in our survey were registered Asian Americans, we see that they actually were pretty high participants in politics more generally. On the other hand, young voters were notably less enthusiastic about the election. So you can see here, when we asked them about, compared to previous elections, are you more or less enthusiastic, that younger voters were less likely to say they were more enthusiastic. It's still pretty high, almost 50%, but compared to older voters, they were less enthusiastic. And you can see 30% actually said they were less enthusiastic. So there's some kind of interesting contradictions in these data. Younger Asian American voters were more likely to identify as Democrats and to take a progressive position on every political issue we talked about. And so we are seeing somewhat of a generational divide among the Asian American population, where younger voters are more likely to identify as Democrat and more likely to take a progressive position on issues like gun control, the environment, healthcare, and immigration. And this is in some ways pretty astounding because the overall Asian American population tends to be already pretty left-leaning on many of these issues. Another issue that is actually in the news this week, because yesterday there were arguments in the Court of Appeals over the Harvard affirmative action case. We see these numbers that already we know that a majority of Asian Americans support affirmative action, but here you can see that younger Asian American voters are even more likely than their older counterparts to say that they favor affirmative action, and they're less likely to oppose. So only 10% of Asian American voters 18 to 34 said that they oppose affirmative action. On the issue of whether local governments should shift spending from law enforcement to other kinds of programs, we do see a bit of a generational break here, with younger voters much more likely to say that they approve of this kind of shift, to agree with this kind of shift in spending priorities compared to the very oldest voters and to the Asian American population more generally. There's also much more familiarity and support for the Black Lives Matter movement among young people, and I think we would probably expect this. So what you see here is that younger Asian Americans aged 18 to 34 were more likely to say that they were favorable towards the Black Lives Matter movement than unfavorable. And that's actually true for every group. So it's interesting to note here that even among the very oldest cohort, those who are 50 and older, that group was more likely to say that they were favorable than unfavorable. At the same time, they were way less likely to say they were favorable towards Black Lives Matter than people Asian American voters 18 to 34. Note, though, there's also a lot of difference in familiarity towards the Black Lives Matter movement. So younger people are more familiar. Older people, 1 out of 5 is not very familiar with the movement. But at the same time, we hear about this generational divide a lot. I also want to underscore that older Asian American voters are not more racially conservative necessarily than US voters more generally. So while 41% of all American voters generally disapprove of Black Lives Matter, that number is actually smaller that proportion is smaller among Asian Americans. So this is something that I think is really interesting because many of you are familiar with the Letters for Black Lives project, and there's a lot of discussion about anti-Blackness among older Asian Americans. At the same time, I think it's critical to remind ourselves that, as a racialized group, Asian Americans who are older or are first generation are often more progressive on race than, let's say, white Americans of the same racial background. And so I think that we're always in this balance of really trying to confront anti-Blackness in our communities, but also understanding that our communities are racialized and they tend actually not to be as racially conservative as, let's say, white Americans of the same age group and cohort. So I'll just end it with there, except to note one last thing, which I didn't put on this slide, which is that young people in our study were actually more likely to be contacted by political parties than older Asian Americans. The group least likely to be contacted by either of the two main parties were actually those who were the oldest. So it's kind of a flip of what we understand from US politics more generally. So usually older voters are the ones that the parties hit up. But I think as we see the parties moving towards more digital organizing, especially in a pandemic, that it's actually those with cell phones who are getting hit the most, and those who who are on social media who are getting hit the most in terms of mobilization. And I'm happy to answer any more questions about methodology or other trends that you're interested in, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to Christine.
Great. So in terms of next steps, I did go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the things that you could do, like signing up for our Disinformation network. But one thing in particular is that we've noticed that there are a number of individuals and organizations that have never done voter engagement work, but they're now realizing that they really want to organize for this election. So what we did is we went ahead and launched a relational organizing campaign through Outreach Circle. During this pandemic time period, we're not necessarily engaging with individuals out at community festivals or grocery stores or other natural gathering places. So we're really relying on increasing the number of volunteers who can tap into their own personal networks. We know that through relational organizing, it's a fun and easy way to recruit friends to help out, but then it's also a way for you to track your own network to really figure out how you can even maximize your reach and to encourage people to register and to go vote and to actually get ready for the elections. So with that, we went ahead and created 3 different outreach circles. One, if you're with a organization. Another one is if you're just an individual volunteer that wants to help out, as well as those who are with youth-affiliated organizations. With that, if you sign up, whether it's through your app or through the laptop, you'll be receiving like 2 or 3 different actions every week that will be in line with what is happening and messaging for that week, where are some of the upcoming deadlines that they may be happening. So for instance, this week and next week, we'll be focusing on providing a lot of content all around voter registration. So this is like an easy way for you to get the action items be able to modify it for that, so that way it sounds more authentic to your own voice. And then since it's all connected with all your different social media platforms or email, it's really easy to be able to share this and this message with all your friends and family, whoever you decide you really want to engage with. And once again, this is really made so that way you don't have to be an expert, and we're hoping that you will really be able to utilize your own networks of family and friends to do this. The other thing is really immediately is I'm encouraging all of you to participate in National Voter Registration Day, which is next Tuesday. Follow APIAVote throughout the day. We are going to be highlighting different influencers that are going to be promoting this day, different organizations and interesting social media posts, just so that way people will get an idea of like the importance of voter registration and how the voter registration deadlines are closing quite soon. You're going to see a lot of activity through Google, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, all the various platforms. They are all partners with National Voter Registration Day. This is a nonpartisan effort just to make sure that we increase the numbers registered in our own communities. Also, you should know that heading into 2020, we were looking at numbers, not only just in the API community, but just nationally, of having more participation from individuals and people registering. But because of the pandemic, we are now behind in comparison to 2016. So it's really important for us to get as many individuals to participate for NVRD next week. And in addition, on their website, they do have posters and stickers and things that you could go ahead and post. And for those who are still by a Asian grocery store, because we know that people are still going to the grocery stores, you know, these are still made available, so you can print them out and post them at wherever people can see it. I also want to flag for October 24th, we are also asking all of you to participate in that as well. This is also another holiday, but it's really focusing on voting early in itself. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over, and before we actually have a Q&A.
Thank you to you both for really interesting findings, as well as giving us solid ways in which we can participate and help in this effort to get the vote out. So we have a question from Eric, and he asks, do you see any gender differences among Asian American voters, political activists, etc.? Are women more progressive, less, the same, and the like?
So I can answer that, and I'll just share my screen right here if you want. Let me see if I can, yeah. So if you look at the link up here that I dropped it in for Eric, but into the Q&A, but we actually have all of these data posted at AAPI data, and you can see that you can look at all of the results by gender. And so there are some areas where we see a little bit of a difference. So men and women, for instance, are both as likely to say that they have similar rates of support for Biden. When it comes to Trump, women are less likely to say they'll vote for Trump. So there's more undecideds there, for instance. Or if you look at an issue like, so it's surprising. Usually we see more women supporting gun control, but in this case, you don't see much of a difference among Asian American men and women. But if you go to other issues, you can basically see that all of these, all of our questions are actually broken down by gender. And so I did scroll through and looked at some of the results. And I remember there were some surprising areas where men were actually more progressive on certain issues than women, even though in US politics more generally, women tend to lean a little bit more progressive. So hopefully Eric can check out those, that tab whenever, but there are some small differences.
Great, thank you, Janelle. We have a question from Juanita. She says, What is the last day or days for voter registration?
That really depends by state, and even some states are providing same-day voter registration. So I'll go ahead and provide a link in there where you could go onto our website where all that information resides state by state. But for the most part, that's why we have National Voter Registration Day, because after that, it's really within a week or two that a large majority of states, their registrations do actually come and expire.
And I'll just say that in California, everyone who is registered is being mailed a vote by mail ballot. In Maryland, we are facing some serious challenges. So most people who have been registered as absentee would expect to get an absentee ballot, but this year you have to take another step and actually request a mail-in ballot. So there's actually an extra step for everybody this year that's kind of confusing. I mean, I've been voting in this state for a long time and I'm a political scientist, and I was still pretty confused over how to get my ballot this year. So there's been some controversy in Maryland that it actually got a lot harder this year to vote.
Do either of you know what it's like in Virginia, since it's in this area?
I would have to take a look real quick.
Okay.
Why don't we move on to the next question?
Hey, Christine's a Virginia voter.
I haven't even been focusing on like, when am I going to vote?
You're just getting out the whole Asian American community. That's
I know.
all.
It's really sad, actually. I tell everybody all the different options, and half the time I'm literally voting on election day because I didn't have time to like vote early.
Another big issue is we're seeing that there are fewer and fewer options for, so usually, there are oftentimes voting there on the day of the election, you can find a place to vote on your campus. And that is becoming much more unlikely. I don't know what the Maryland plan is. Maybe someone on this call does, but there's nationwide, there's definitely indications that there's going to be fewer options for students to vote on their campus, partly due to COVID, partly due to voter suppression.
Am I mistaken in remembering that they said that we're going to open up the stadium for voting? Janelle, does that sound familiar to you? You're muted.
I actually don't know.
Okay.
That's a good thing to find out, because I saw that, for instance, there was a news story yesterday that Georgia had opened for, University of Georgia had opened for football, but had not been able to use that same space for voting. In fact, that had usually been a place, they had usually been able to vote on their campus, but weren't going to be able to do that this year. So it's definitely a good thing for us to look into.
Okay. I don't see any new questions, so I'll use this opportunity to ask my own. I know that there's the kind of the usual suspects for barriers to voting for Asian Americans, but can you talk a little bit about what's anticipated in this kind of pandemic context, additional barriers to voting for Asian Americans specifically, or even broadly, that we should be thinking about?
I think overall it is quite similar in terms of not understanding what are your different options. And so even if there is education being held, it's primarily done in English. And so it really is about how do we relay this information to those that are limited English proficient. And when we ourselves are also confused, right? So first of all, we need to keep up with what all the different changes, and then be able to articulate that and have those kind of conversations. And I think we all need to be a lot more proactive about having these kind of conversations with everyone. And for Virginia, it looks like, they typically have early voting options, and I've taken advantage of that before. And But I just looked on their website and I linked it into the chat room. You could go ahead and start voting 45 days ahead of time. So that they've actually expanded that.
Great, thank you for that. Brandon Kim asks, in addition to climate change, are there any other environmental issues that Asian Americans are in support of? For instance, environmental justice, recycling, etc. And if so, how much support is given?
Yeah, so thanks, Brandon. That has been, we've asked all kinds of, this survey actually only asked about the climate change and whether the president and Congress should do more on that issue. But our past surveys have asked about, for instance, increasing restrictions on emissions, or I just did a study of people in California on recycling. And on all of these issues, we see that Asian Americans are more likely to be supportive than the general population. So it's definitely been frustrating to me to see that mobilization and organizing around environmental issues has actually never really targeted Asian Americans, when this is clearly something that our communities care about.
There aren't any other questions. There aren't questions coming through at this moment. I see one from Joseph Liu. He asks, with the rise of anti-China rhetoric used by politicians, primarily by Republicans, has there been an impact on Asian Americans in voting in terms of participation, who they vote for, etc.?
I mean, there is one issue that we're starting to hear a little bit, but I believe the health community is trying to understand it a little bit more, is that they've been looking at the COVID rates and death rates in certain cities, and they realized that it's actually a lot higher than expected. And some of the things that they're deducting is that there may, because of the rise of anti-Asian violence and sentiment, that individuals may be a little bit more hesitant in terms of coming out. And as a result, they're also not necessarily getting checked and getting the medical help that they may need. So if that's the case in terms of health, then that could also correlate in terms of whether or not they feel comfortable enough to actually go out and go vote. And that's also another reason why it's so important for us to really identify and figure out, what's the best way to educate them about their options if they don't want to show up in person to go vote.
Yeah, and I would say that, in this survey, healthcare is the number one issue, and that, of course, includes the public health issue of COVID. A majority do worry that they won't be able to access healthcare because of COVID. But in terms of the polls and their behavior, so 48% say they worry about the health and safety of voting in person or at the polls because of COVID. And so that's why I think we see that the majority do plan to vote by mail, and that really does put pressure on voter education, I think, and having a lot of good materials about how to vote by mail. So that's an issue. At the same time, in terms of vote choice, we've seen that, for instance, even though we see rhetoric like the China flu or the Kung flu coming out of from elected officials, it doesn't seem like there's a core of people who that does not seem to be affecting their vote choice. On the flip side, we have definitely seen that non-Asian Americans' views of Asian Americans have become a little bit more negative over time, and that there's a partisan kind of split there. So anti-Asian sentiment has increased a little bit over the last 6 months. And in terms of whether or not people think that the term Kung flu or China flu is appropriate, the majority of Americans don't think that those terms are appropriate, but there's a partisan split. So Democrats are way more likely to say those terms are inappropriate. Republicans, a fair majority, I think, do think those terms are appropriate.
Interesting. Okay, so we have a question from Patrick Peralta. He asks, Has there been a divide in the AAPI community to Kamala Harris as the Democratic VP nominee, given her record with criminal justice and minority communities? In this case, but more broadly, do AAPIs view policies or representation as more salient and relevant to them?
You know, I think that goes back to the different generations of the voters. So there is always going to be still a segment of our population where they're, you know, how they identify as a Asian American or Indian American, that's going to override anything in regards to policy issues, right? And then there are those who are going to look beyond race or gender and really just focusing more about what they stand for in terms of issues. And then, you know, there are also going to be voters in regards to the idea that, you know, we're always presented a slate of candidates. There really is, in all the history, there's never been a perfect candidate for everyone. So it really is more about identifying, looking at that candidate, who they surround themselves with, as well as the different political parties, and you making your best guess in terms of who you think you're going to be able to best influence. So that way, once they are elected, that you're able to go ahead and try to support the issues that you care about. And so that's why there's also another thing that we need to remind everyone is that the work and engagement does not end on November 3rd. It really is a launching pad where we hold these elected officials accountable, but it's not only just on the presidential level, but also in Congress, because the president cannot move things by themselves. It really needs to be in support of Congress, but also down the ticket of local elections are just as important. I think we're seeing that with this pandemic, that local elected officials are making decisions that impact your life day to day, and we're paying attention. But we need to, once again, make that correlation that these decisions are impacting our lives right now. You can make a difference by depending on your vote.
Yeah, we did ask on this survey, but I don't think we reported it out about people's favorability towards Kamala Harris. And just glancing at the data, I think in general, Asian Americans were favorable, more favorable than unfavorable, but there were some interesting, I know that as you might expect, Indian Americans were the most enthusiastic about Harris. And that's interesting because on the issues that Patrick raises, Indian Americans are the most progressive on race in the Asian American community also. So, you know, the record on criminal justice for Harris sort of cuts both ways among that group, Indian Americans.
I did also note in the chat that, you know, we were talking about like how we need to go ahead and educate more people about the process of their early voting options. So we do have a daunting task of, besides the mail, that we are trying to contact and have conversations with 700,000 households. So we are encouraging all of you to also consider hosting phone banking parties with your family and friends. And I placed in the chat like how you can sign up and join us in this effort.
And I'll just remind you that APIAVote is nonpartisan. So this is really about just strengthening our democracy, getting more people registered to vote.
Thank you. Any final thoughts from either speaker?
You know, for me, it really boils down to that we really don't have the option of inaction. We really need each and every one of you to whatever capacity that you have to participate in some manner, whether it's with a selected few or in a broader scope. But please consider helping us out and really starting those conversations. It really can just start with a simple conversation, especially as people are reconnecting with friends and family, checking in on folks. It's so easy to integrate this into your conversation, but we really need to do that and to making sure that it's part of our everyday conversation and not necessarily something like, oh gosh, politics, we can't be talking about that. It's too divisive. We need to just, because all the other communities understand that, and that's why they are gaining political power, because they are voting.
And thanks for having us. We really appreciate it. If you're on this webinar, you're obviously engaged in politics. And so, that's exciting to me. This is your election, and every single person should be involved here, not just in terms of the presidential vote, but there are so many important issues on the ballot this year. And, I think this is the time for young Asian Americans to really be heard, and this is our chance. It's clear that young Asian Americans have distinct political views, and so time to, really make other people understand those views.
Well, thank you so much. Please, if you will, for the attendees, join me in thanking Christine Chen and Janelle Wong for this very important discussion. We will be sure to share the resources and links to both the survey results, but also to ways in which you can get involved on our website, on the Asian American Studies website, so that you'll have access to this information. Thank you all again for coming and being a part of this talk and webinar. And I hope you have a great evening.